paranormal. It surrounds us. It's everywhere. Tonight, you will hear from the people who live and work within these highly active locations, all in the efforts to discover America's most haunted. With your host, ghost hunter and author, Dan Terry.
Good evening, boys and ghouls, and welcome back. I am Dan Terry, your ghost host with the most haunted. But today, we're going to be going slightly off into left field and doing something a little different. I did go to the president of Onyx Network, Margie Kay, and I explained to her what was going on with a lot of bowing and Madam Presidents and all of that stuff. But she told me, Dan, you are the premier ghost hunter from the Midwest. Your name is well known through Kansas, Missouri, Southern Illinois, Arkansas. In fact, your name will probably outlive time. Well, who am I to argue? I'm a modest man. She said, I understand you know more and want to do other things. You are interested in more than simply the ghost part. So just say it's a special and do what you want. So this is a special. And again, if you're really into the ghosts and demons, come back next week. I want you here for this one. This one's important, especially you folks from the Midwest. But come on back next week, because next week I've got two ladies coming on who have not only fought the demonic forces, but had to stand toe-to-toe with their human minions and fight them. So it's going to be a really cool show. But for this one, I'm going to take you back into the past. I'm going back to a time when not everybody carried a mobile television station in their pocket. This is going back to a time when there wasn't 24-hour news. Back to a time when people trusted the government and did what they said. And I want you to imagine a time like that with a crash of a plane nobody could identify. Not a UFO, not aliens. Those words were not created. What we're talking about is a plane crash where the locals came and seen it, got a preacher there to say his last rites or to comfort or whatever they needed him to do, before they realized these weren't humans. These were not people as we know the term. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking I'm talking about Roswell. The anniversary of Roswell was just last week. This one happened 6 years before Roswell in a small town in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. And I'm going to introduce you right now to the man who wrote the first book that I know of, I believe it was the first, on this crash. It's called MO41, The Bombshell Before Roswell. And this is going to be a story that's just awesome. So let's bring on Paul Blake Smith.
Dan, I'm very pleased to meet you. Glad to be on your show. It's a terrific subject and it made for an exciting book. I just wish it could get more attention from like Hollywood or somebody, but we'll get into it. And it will really turn some people around. I think if you thought Roswell was the first UFO crash in America, I might be able to convince you that it was not.
And I am convinced because I read the book. I'd heard these stories before, but I think you're the first one to actually write about this, aren't you?
I believe there was a very fine lady named Linda L. Wallace who wrote a Kindle book that I don't believe was ever published. And she's done some research from the Sikeston, Missouri angle of the story. And but mine is apparently the only one. I wrote a second one, and I'm not very happy with that. So I'm rewriting that currently to release it in a more edited and corrected manner. And I did that actually to the first one. I hope if anyone buys my book, you will get the 2020 revised edition.
Well, I picked up Richard Belzer's book about, and I don't remember the title. It's like Things You Didn't Know or Things You Thought You Knew or something to that effect. But he specifically mentioned your book and the incident. So it's very similar to Roswell, except it happened halfway across the country. Right. What happened on that night? I guess it was around Easter.
I'm finding that my original theory that it happened around Easter was off by about 2 weeks. I think it was late April. That was one of the reasons I rewrote my first book and re-released it. In the last days of April 1941, America was not at war. We were getting closer and closer, though. President Roosevelt was in office, and he was quite bound to the White House because he was bound to a wheelchair. He had his paralysis, and he was not in great shape, but he was doing the best he could. He had actually been in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, which is a small town, about 20,000 in 1941. Today, it's double that. FDR had been in Cape Girardeau in 1920, I think it was, when he was running for vice president. So he knew the town. He had been there and seen some of the leading citizens of the era. So he was not clueless when they finally phoned him that night, probably, to tell him there's a strange aerial crash, and it does not appear to have been of anything of this earth. Now, I don't know for sure he was called that night, but it had to have been either that night or the next morning. It's April of 41, and my grandfather was a judge in town. He used to be city attorney of Cape Girardeau, and he probably would have been on the scene, but my family talked him out of being city attorney a year or so before the crash. So there's a bad break. My grandfather's long since passed on, so I was not able to interview him for this book. But in late April of 41, it was a very Christian community in Cape Girardeau. Lots of people went to church. And in doing research for the book, the local Cape Girardeau newspaper would weekly have almost like a box score. Who had the most church attendance at all the churches around town. So the reason I point this out is because this is the main witness for this story was a Christian pastor. Mm-hmm. In those days, you went for counseling or ministering from a pastor, and if there was a tragedy like what they thought was going to be an airplane crash, you would have called a minister probably right away to help out and to say prayers and to comfort people spiritually. Mm-hmm. So in my research, I found out that the Reverend William G. Huffman was indeed a pastor. He lived on Main Street, North Main Street in Cape, and he lived right across the street from the town's Justice of the Peace. So I think on that night, it was an all hands on deck because a cry went out that there had been an airplane crash outside of town in a farm field. And they all thought, oh my goodness, there's going to be people on the ground broken up or dead, relatives rushing to the scene, distraught. They need a minister to go with them to comfort people, someone they trust. And the Justice of the Peace may have looked right out his window, seen Reverend Huffman at his home, maybe standing out front, and decided, I'll call him, because that's Reverend Huffman's story. He was called like after 9 o'clock at night in late April 41 and told there's been an airplane crash. Can you come with me? He said it was a person associated with the Cape Girardeau Police Department. He didn't say he was a member. So the man came around in a unmarked car and took him about 13 miles outside of town. And what they found when they got out there was pretty clear. It was not an airplane crash.
So at this time in 1941, the Germans were probably invading Poland. There was the Japanese fighting and growing and a constant threat with them. The world was in turmoil. Do you think anyone would have even thought this could be some kind of enemy craft that crashed or military crash maybe?
I'm sure that was the first thought on many people's minds. We just didn't have ETs, UFOs, even flying saucers back then. About the best you had with maybe Buck Rogers or a comic strip set in space or something like that. There were no sci-fi movies, no sci-fi TV shows in 1941. FDR was probably not thinking of this whatsoever. I don't think there had been any previous crashes. This was probably a real shock back then. And I'll just flash forward to, as you mentioned, that Roswell happened 6 years later. And as I mentioned in my book, forces moved into the Roswell area to box up and hush up witnesses, box up the remains, the crash debris. They swiftly jumped on this. How did they get there so fast and know what to do and have these boxes and everything? If it weren't for the Cape Girardeau crash giving them a kind of template on how to handle these sort of things from 6 years earlier, that military intelligence people able to get a call and whip into action and fly down there, because it wasn't really so much the Roswell Army Air Base that responded to the crash. It was some outside military intelligence people. So in going back to Cape Girardeau, this flaming wreckage was in a farm field, and it caused the owner of the farm to jump on the phone and call for the fire department. And in my hometown of Cape Girardeau, I grew up there. In those days, the fire department and the police department were in the same building and handled the same calls. So they responded quickly and sent out a force thinking, oh my gosh, it's a plane crash. This could be a real mess. And I'm sure doctors and nurses were contacted and went rushing to the scene as best they could. Reverend Huffman was called, and he went in there and said he had to walk a ways to get through this farm field and over to the crash site, and found out to his shock that it was not a cylindrical airplane with wings. It was a round disc with no wings, no exhaust, no propellers. It was starting to get quite dark, but there were flashlights and probably lanterns in those days, and the headlights from cars. And there was also still the flaming wreckage. It had set this field on fire. And Reverend Huffman said later that night to his family, the fire department were there putting out this big fire that leaped up all around this crash. It was probably just shocking and traumatic, and it was something he never forgot. So he knew that this was a very serious situation. And he saw local people there, the sheriff, a couple men in military uniforms, and even saw an FBI man and a couple newspaper reporters, one with a big flash camera taking pictures for the news. And this was a big, big event in a sleepy town like Cape Girardeau.
I'm sure, yeah. So
yeah,
in your book,
was what shocked him for life, yeah.
In your book, you did mention it, and I think people who are into the UFOs would ask. So 1898, I think it was, the Aurora crash. Do you think that was also a crash, or was, because it seems like, even as you said, the military was there really, really fast.
Yeah, and there's a reason for that. In 1897, there might have been a UFO crash in Aurora, Texas, and it's still a matter of debate. And it seems like we're probably never going to get to the truth of that. However, there's two UFO investigators, one Kevin Randall, the other Bill Burns, and they'd love to get this story, get the scoop. And they've looked into the Aurora crash, and they've decided it's not an extraterrestrial crash.
Really? Okay.
Kevin Randall thinks it was a metal-clad balloon they were experimenting with at like Fort Worth, or another fort, a military installation in the Texas area, and that's probably what came down. Okay. So if that is true, then Cape Girardeau would be the first.
Yes, it would. Okay, go ahead with your story, because I know there was a photo at one time of the alien.
Yeah. Well, Reverend Huffman looked on the ground, and there were 3 extraterrestrial gray-looking bodies. They were long, thin arms and long, thin legs and long, thin fingers and big heads with big black eyes, what we call your typical grays nowadays. And they had a little dot for nostrils and a little slit for a mouth. And he found that 2 were very decidedly motionless and dead. And a third one was so barely alive, respirating, breathing, his chest going up just a bit. So he knelt down to say prayers as best he could, expecting human bodies on the ground, and that was his job. to say prayers. I don't think he read the last rites. That is a Catholic ritual. Reverend Huffman was a Baptist.
Yes, yes.
But in any rate, he looked over and noticed that two local men in civilian attire were propping up one of the dead aliens and holding him out, holding his arms out and posing for a photographer from the newspaper with a big old flash camera, and they took a picture. And then they put the alien down, and Reverend Huffman sat up as he noticed the one he was saying prayers for had died. He was motionless. He was gone. And so he wandered over to this round silver craft and peeked inside, and you could see inside. Maybe people were also shining flashlights in there, and he could see a kind of flight deck or control panel and a silver band around the top of the what we would call a cockpit, and it had strange symbols, almost like hieroglyphics that he couldn't understand. And it was just probably a total shock, like, what in the world is this? And so just as he and other people were picking up debris and looking over things and talking and maybe giving the eyewitness accounts to the newspaper man, there was an invasion of the site. Only this time it was by the United States Army.
Okay.
It turns out that the Army had an aerial training program in Sikeston, Missouri, about 35 miles to the south. And the brother of that unit, he was one of the leaders of that unit, was the brother of the Cape County Sheriff. Remember that Reverend Huffman saw like police and sheriff's department at the scene. Yes. So it makes sense that you would probably call, who would you call? You know, from Ghostbusters. Well, probably you would call their nearest military installation that deals with aerial training. Again, they might have thought, is this an experimental craft maybe gone awry from the Sikeston Air Base? So that's how they galvanized a force to come up in trucks, him in the site, and they ordered everyone to drop what you are holding. No evidence is to be collected. It appears to have been, they were under orders from high up. Make sure nobody talks about this. This was a matter of national security. You did not see this. It did not happen. There is to be no evidence, no reports in the newspaper. We'll take those photos, please. Mm-hmm. I should back up and clarify something really quick. Sure. The man who took the photograph of the alien had a big news graphic, I think they called it, camera, but he had whipped out a small Brownie box camera from his pocket to take a photograph of the dead alien being propped up. And then he snuck that camera back in his pocket when the Army showed up. And that's how he was able to sneak that picture out of the site and not tell the Army this valuable piece of evidence that was going to make history. Right. He had his, like his camera probably confiscated and the film removed, and any photographic evidence official for the news was removed from the scene. And there was a Cape Girardeau fireman who said on his deathbed decades later, I was at the scene of the crash. This Reverend Huffman story is entirely true. I know I was fighting the fire. I saw the aliens, the dead bodies. I saw the craft, and I helped fight the flames that the crash caused, and that the Army came in and caught me trying to pocket a piece of debris, and they chewed me out, forced me to hand it over, and they kicked me out of the crash site, he said. And he said that I was watched very carefully around town in the days afterwards, and maybe weeks. Said he had his phone tapped. He was sure his phone was tapped, and that they were probably, the government, the FBI, were worried that he might be bitter at being kicked out of there and being chewed out, so that he might try to tell people what he saw. Like, you can't tell me to keep quiet. I looked it up and found to my surprise that the FBI did indeed have a field office in Cape Girardeau. It opened up 1 month, or maybe close to 2 months before the crash. So the Reverend Huffman story all holds together. Circumstantially, yes, we're still not finding the hard proof. And I don't know if anyone has pinpointed the exact site. I think I know a kind of general location, and I'm not telling anyone because I don't want to get sued, but right. It's a great story. You know, in Roswell, it's out in the desert, and you've had lots of camera crews and investigators go out there, and they can poke around in the open desert all they want. But in Cape Girardeau, this is a farm field. There's a number of them, and it's somebody's home and it's somebody's business. You don't go trespassing on their land and tearing up their field. And you know, I've been told a number of times you better wear strong boots even when you're walking out there. We got a lot of rattlesnakes and copperheads that go through the fields and eat the small rodents and such. So it's dangerous on a number of levels. You never know if you might find a hostile landowner with a shotgun if you go poking around his property without permission. So I don't recommend anyone go out there and look for it. But it's a terrific story that may have been squelched right from the beginning. And I'm thinking the government has come back probably over the years and scoured that place for any remaining evidence. There is a story I read online from a topics forum board. I don't think that's in business anymore. But they gave a story of my grandparents, this one young man said, own the property where the farm crash occurred. And he said they held on to the property and sold it just after the war, I think he said. And the grandson couldn't get the whole story from his grandparents. They were obviously still scared for the rest of their lives to talk, thoroughly intimidated. He only got dribs and drabs of this amazing story. So he flew to Cape Girardeau, he said, and went to talk to the landowner. And it was now an old man who had bought the land. And the man said, they didn't tell me about any crash of a aerial vehicle or a spaceship. He said, but I was digging a cistern in the soil and found these strange bits of metal with strange hieroglyphic symbols on some of them. And he said, I couldn't cut or bend them at all. I mean, you couldn't crease them. So he collected them all up in a box and stuck them in his old barn. And the young man said he wouldn't tell me what he did with that after that. And so it's just so exasperating. You want to get the hard truth and the whole facts and, you know, really solid, tangible evidence to prove this amazing story, and it keeps slipping through your fingers.
Did I read somewhere, maybe it was in your book, maybe it was somewhere else, that the log sheet for the fire department that night had been removed from the book where they write down their calls?
There is one existing log sheet. It doesn't tell anything particularly special, like a big crash, you know, but it does give a list of April 1941 events that the fire department reported to. There's a couple in late April. They're not very specific, but it might help. But frankly, it may be incomplete. It may have been scrubbed or whitewashed and rewritten for all we know. It was so much evidence from 1941 has been thrown out, frankly. I don't think part of any great government conspiracy. I think just over time they threw away records, police records. I went down to the Cape Girardeau Police Department headquarters in town and asked, do you have any records from 1941? They said, no, everything's been digitized and old paperwork's been thrown away. So
so much that we could find out if some of that old reports existed, even the sheriff's report, you know, there was a plane crash.
It's so difficult because not only are every person from that era is long since deceased. I found in my research that even their children in many cases are deceased. And so if they didn't tell the story or just told a little bit to their kids and now their kids are gone, this was 1941, a long time ago. About 80 years ago, 81 now. And so it's so tough to get a firm grip on it. One woman I talked to, since passed away, said, I was like an 11-year-old girl on a farm not far away when I remember the adults gathering excitedly and talking about this little spaceship and these little men from space that had crashed not far away. And they said, I was not shown the evidence, but I remember those adults talking about it back then. And she wanted to make sure we didn't say ET or UFO or flying saucer. Right. They just called it the little men from space. And I think that added authenticity to her story.
It does. Yeah, it does. During this time period, again, people are worried about war. They're worried about the enemy. Government is, I'm sure, trying to stop any panic from coming on if it had been a Nazi or Japanese craft. But you would think somehow that information would have gotten out before this.
Right. I haven't found any evidence so far, any real eyewitness account or any fragment that would tell us that this was man-made, that this was a special German weapon, or it had a swastika on it or something like that, or that it was an air balloon or, weather balloon, nothing like that. The stories really hold together what I've managed to put in my book, that it was a small disc, a metal disc, sort of silver gray, seamless, with no wings. And these really were alien looking bodies. If you recall, Colonel Philip Corso, who wrote The Day After Roswell, he said that the scientists at the Pentagon have concluded through their examination of the Roswell crash victims that they were like gray bio-robots, like they were created in a lab. And I think that would probably be an accurate description of Cape. They were identical. There was nothing different, like they were punched out of a mold. So these may have been advanced aliens that created these creatures, bio-robots, cyborgs, whatever you want to call them. They were still breathing, and had human-like features somewhat, but that they were expendable, that you could just go back to the lab and get some more. So that's why aliens did not return for the evidence. That would have caused even a bigger uproar if you land and say, give our fallen brethren back to us and we'll take that spaceship. Nothing like that happened.
How did the story initially come out? If I remember right, a daughter or granddaughter of the preacher brought it out?
Right. Let me backtrack just a bit. You remember that photograph taken at the scene? Reverend Huffman said he was at home about 2 or 3 weeks after the crash event, and the photographer himself showed up at his door in Cape Girardeau and had a copy of this photo of the dead alien being propped up. And he said the newsman who took the picture handed over a copy and said, I have a copy of this. I want you to have a copy. Obviously, he was worried about the story dying out. They wanted evidence to be shared secretly in case someday they had to produce some proof.
Yes.
Reverend Huffman, I don't think really wanted the picture, and he stored it away, and the family moved on. They moved to Oklahoma and then Kansas. And Reverend Huffman's surviving son, one died in World War II. The other got married and had children. And the 2 daughters grew up, and they would pass that photograph around at family parties. And I don't think Reverend Huffman even wanted to talk about it then. He was sworn to silence. He told his family that night of the crash where he had been and what happened. And I think he kept his mouth shut for the rest of his life. But his son may have spoken about it and showed people this alien photograph. Well, the young daughter had seen that 10, 12 times at family events, and it really creeped her out. Her name was Charlotte Mann, formerly Huffman. And she said one day a neighbor came over and asked or was talking about events of another worldly nature. And so her father, Reverend Huffman's son, brought out the photograph. And the guy looked it over and said, this is very interesting. I have a friend who's into like zoology. I'll show it to him. He took off with the picture and never came back. In fact, I think he moved out of town like a week later. So there is some research that shows that this man who took it may have been within Army intelligence during World War II. And he knew the significance of this evidence. And there goes our last piece of evidence that we know of. So if you see this photograph of an alien propped up on the internet, this is a recreation for the Sci-Fi Channel series from 2003 called The Secret, Evidence That We're Not Alone. They recreated Reverend Huffman watching the 2 men have this alien propped up, or they picked it up and held it and posed. So we don't have the actual picture. It's gone to history, I'm afraid.
Well, there was another copy from the guy who was there.
Yeah, how many copies did he have? That's what I want to know.
And what happened to him?
Yeah, we don't know his precise identification, but it's strongly indicated this man was named Garland D. Fronebarger. He was the most distant relative of mine you can get. He was my grandfather's brother-in-law's cousin or something like this. Yeah. And he was in my family home. I'm told by my aunt that this photographer was in the Smith family home back in the 50s, and he recommended using a brownie box camera. And that's exactly what's in this story. So I'm pretty sure it's Mr. Fronebarger. Well, he's passed away, and his home is owned by somebody else now. I'd like to think that if they search the attic or some crawl space, that they could find some evidence left over. But so far, no one's come forward. If they try to, I would hope that there's no accidental death that just happens if you have proof like this. So far, no one's threatened me, but I don't have any proof whatsoever. And I'll emphasize for your viewers today, I've never seen a UFO, and I've never seen a ghost either, but that doesn't mean they don't exist.
Well, I know that that time period, people were raised to trust the government, believe the government.
Right.
This was before Vietnam and Agent Orange and all that stuff.
So, you did not argue, when your government told you keep your mouth shut. I think so many people did, either intimidated or wanting to do the patriotic thing. So we also felt likely we had ourselves a real secret weapon that we could perhaps turn into a weapon of war, according to FDR's memorandums in the 40s, from these wonders, these celestial wonders that have come to us. And he turned it over to his Non-Terrestrial Science and Technology Committee to see if we can weaponize this discovery. And another report mentioned the Missouri recovery of 1941. Well, what does that tell us? That we really had a crash, and they tried to back engineer it, examine it, and see if they can turn some of this information that they learned from it into a part of our atomic weapons broadcast or weapons system, or a communication system, or any nuclear energy. I wish I had more on that. I put as much as I could in my book. It's still sketchy, but I really think the government seized on this disk and really went to town on putting their best scientists into looking into what made this thing tick.
And what was the memorandums Roosevelt put out you was talking about? Do you know what they were, where you mentioned the celestial evidence or whatever you said?
A lot of that was in 42, 44. When we were involved with war, we went to war here in America in December of 41, and things really got revved up in 42. And it mentions in a 42 memorandum getting a scientist named Dr. Vannevar Bush, the top scientist for FDR, who I've read in other books. That was his name pops up in UFO back engineering, so it kind of holds together there. FDR would have trusted him to examine this and see if we can duplicate it or weaponize it. And then it's fascinating to know that President Roosevelt, I'll get the name right, formed a Non-Terrestrial Science and Technology Committee. Well, what could that possibly have been other than a crashed spaceship? For instance, a meteorite landing was not science and technology. It would have been just a rock. So what else could have come down that we would have needed to form a high-level scientific group to behind the scenes in World War II, try to take advantage of this? And so Cape Girardeau's discovery may have had a real impact behind the scenes. But again, it's so tough to get the hard facts, and our government doesn't want to help us. I'm afraid they're not forthcoming on this.
Well, Colonel Corso's book, which I hover between it being real and being misinformation, because the man was a lifelong Army soldier, but he does mention many of the things that supposedly came from Roswell is now being used today. The different types of circuits, chips, ultraviolet visual at night vision. So I wonder how much of that might have come from Missouri as well.
It's a good question. We can speculate till the cows come home, but I don't know. And I agree with you that Colonel Corso's book is fairly interesting. I thought they kind of dulled it down a little. What an exciting topic. But he said that privately, I understand he was not happy with his co-author, and they did not proof it. They did not check some of the facts that they put in there. well enough, and you can pick his book apart a little bit. So he does not mention Cape Girardeau, but I think he had more information to share, and he was going to do so, but he passed away. Natural causes or not, I don't know. So it's frustrating even from that aspect to get the facts on Roswell. But as I said, I think Roswell was cleaned up pretty quick and squelched based on the template of the Cape Girardeau affair from 6 years earlier.
Mm-hmm. And the whole idea of the weather balloon and all of that, they seem to be pretty prompt with it.
Yeah. Roswell, I'm not an expert, but you see plenty of information on the History Channel now on this, that there was a secret intelligence officer's diary that's come forward. And
I missed that.
Yeah. And it's part of like a 2 or 3 part special on History Channel. But the problem is the diary's in code and they're trying to break the code. And I'm hoping that if they do, it might have a reference to Cape Girardeau and the Mo 41 crash. I call it Mo 41 just to combine the words Missouri 1941 to get across to people that this happened 6 years before New Mexico's crash.
Yes.
But we'll see if they can crack that code in the years to come. I wish somebody would send me a detailed report they found in a chest or in their attic of what happened in Cape Girardeau, or some snapshots or film footage. But so far, my book's been out for about 5 years, and I have not had that. I get the occasional contact from someone who says, I heard it happened here, or my grandparents used to talk about this all the time. If only I had paid more attention, that they used to talk about this quite matter of fact, and I was just a kid at the time. And there are little dribs and drabs of circumstantial evidence, and it's so frustrating. It holds together circumstantially, and many a court case is won on circumstantial evidence alone.
Sure. You have actually went on and done more investigations into, I guess, government conspiracy, the presidency.
Kind of, yeah.
What is the second book about Eisenhower? Was that your second?
Yeah. I produced a second book on the Cape Girardeau crash called 3 Presidents, 2 Accidents.
Okay.
And I'll talk about that briefly, but I'm so unhappy with the book. I want to reissue it, as I mentioned. But there was a source who came forward to me and said, did you know there was another crash site in Cape Girardeau that night? And I said, no, what's this about? He said there was a smaller piece of ship or debris or something that came down in somebody's yard about a mile away. And it happened not too far from a street called Bloomfield Road. And since you are a ghost hunter, I'll tell you there are a number of stories on Bloomfield Road about ghosts and mansions. There are a lot of old homes there, and supposedly a murder story. I've never seen anything, but I've heard people say that I wouldn't go out on that street at night. But
really,
yes. And so there's the tiniest bit of ghost angle to that property area in the 1941 crash. But what I was told from a couple people, including Linda Moulton Howe, an expert more on Roswell, is that the Roswell crash featured a second crash site that they felt was an ejection of an escape pod that, in case of emergency, almost like the movie Harrison Ford movie Air Force One, where the president ejects this escape pod from the president's airplane. And that's fictional, by the way. There is no escape pod from Air Force.
So they say.
Yeah. But this happened at Roswell, and it sounds like it could well be what happened in Cape Girardeau, that this little craft or big hunk of metal or whatever it was landed in somebody's front yard. And it turns out that it was owned by a very conservative political family. And I tried to contact them, and they don't want to talk about it. And you can't go there with a metal detector because it's like off limits. There's signs around that property, no trespassing. You just can't waltz right in there and start poking around. So once again, it's very frustrating. If something happened like that, I wouldn't be surprised. But that was part of my second book. Now, my 2020 book, President Eisenhower's Close Encounters, was another fascinating story I'd heard decades ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I always wanted to put this together in a book, and I tried in the 90s and stopped, in the 2000s and stopped. And finally, I got it all together, and it turned out really well. And it's now a book from foundationsbooks.net, and it's also an audio book from tantor.com. And I've got an agent working with a producer from Hollywood to see if we can turn this into either a television special, a movie, or a theatrical motion picture. You know, I'm not going to hold my breath.
Yeah.
It's something that we might be seeing on a grand scale, that President Eisenhower was aware of UFOs and even had his own sighting in 1952, and that he permitted a communications program of high-frequency radio waves and binary code to set up a meeting with some friendly extraterrestrials at Edwards Air Force Base, February 1954.
And I've heard this legend before, that he actually met him at the end of a runway or something.
Right. He at the edge of a hangar, that he was surrounded by 6 bodyguards, according to one Air Force test pilot who said, "I was there. This really happened." He says, "I was called in for my aerial expertise in aerodynamics and in craft and propulsion systems and such." And he said, "We couldn't believe it. They landed in 5 silent, shiny metal craft, and that they were friendly. They exuded friendliness. They were unarmed. They even invited us to go inside the craft and poke around all we want." There's even a story that the extraterrestrials were human-like and offered the American contingent that met them with Eisenhower to pick up one of our craft and lug it around if you want. And they did, and they found it amazingly lightweight. This is like the greatest story ever, a U.S. president meeting human-like extraterrestrials. And I put as much information as I could into the book. It's gotten a lot of good reviews. I'm very grateful for the kind remarks. I'll just say briefly that in the past 6 or 7 months, I've seen stories in the news about how scientists now feel there are many other planet Earths in the cosmos that evolve like ours, and they also feel there are human beings on other planets fashioned very much like us. And that's exactly what was said to have come down at Edwards Air Force Base, friendly human-type beings. They were slightly different from us. Apparently, they didn't have much hair, and they had a slightly different skin tone. They spoke in English. They expressed their desire to Eisenhower to have us clean up our environment, stop detonating atomic bombs in our atmosphere, and learn to live in more peaceful harmony with the clean, natural environment. And we haven't really listened to them, I'm afraid. And so Eisenhower assessed their amazing abilities and said, "You're so advanced, we can't have this. You're going to have to leave, because there would be a panic here if you started landing, showing up, talking to people, disrupting air traffic, disrupting road traffic, disrupting our economy. We're not ready for you yet." And so I think he asked them to stay kind of at arm's length if they have to come here and check us out and take plant and animal specimens and do scientific testing. And to this day, I think that is held with UFO sightings, but they never seem to land and really come out and talk to people, that they know it would disrupt our society tremendously.
Do you think it would now? We've changed, we've been almost trained to accept this by television shows going back into the 70s.
I agree to a degree. There are people, I think, who would go a little nuts. We've got some unstable people in our society now that go overboard on things. But I agree with you. We're more broken in and used to this. There's ET movies and sitcoms, situation comedies, and television, books, magazines. We're all familiar, and we are all open-minded now, whereas it was much different in the 1940s and 50s. Things have really perked up, and people are thinking about, even the Vatican talks about the probability of life on other planets, and they have an observatory. And it's interesting to see in the news that they've been gathering religious leaders to conduct a little private seminar, supposedly, on what would be the reaction of people in your religion to the revelation that we are being visited, that we're not alone. So it kind of makes you think there could be some sort of announcement or a leak or some sort of slip up in the future, or a broadcast that might reveal some things. I'm hopeful, but I'm not entirely optimistic.
Paul, I wanted to, in the last 3 minutes we've got to talk, I wanted to ask you about your newer book coming out. I believe you're preparing it, and with Oswald and the Kennedy assassination. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, that came out a couple of years ago, based on all the clues that I have that Oswald traveled to Washington, D.C. in late September of 1963 and was seen outside, he stepped out of the Willard Hotel, hotel that's been in the news lately due to the insurrection scandal from the Capitol. Well, back in 63, Oswald was seen there, and a few months before, JFK went into that hotel. And back in 1860s, Abraham Lincoln was a guest in the hotel. And on the day of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, John Wilkes Booth was seen by U.S. Grant's wife, and he was glowering at Julia Grant, and she reported it to her husband, and they took off down the street in a carriage, and Mr. Booth apparently followed him for a while. It was really spooky, but here, what a coincidence that Lincoln and his assassin and JFK and his assassin were all in that hotel at one time or another. So I put together many other clues that indicate that the original plot to kill President Kennedy was set for near the White House. Probably the Willard Hotel would have been a checkpoint or a assassination point, because the President Kennedy was going to go by, and did go by, in an open car motorcade October 2nd, I think it was, of 63. And I think it was the first dry run for the Kennedy assassination in which Oswald took part in Dallas. And so this is kind of lost to history, but I think it makes a fascinating subject, and I hope you'll enjoy the nonfiction book, JFK and the Willard Hotel Plot, and the Eisenhower book, too. It's pretty exciting stuff, really.
It is. And I think it's amazing you're writing this and still alive and still talking about it. So.
Oh, I've got another one coming up that'll get me into trouble. How Jackie Gleason may well have gone to Homestead Air Force Base on the exact anniversary date, February 19th, 1973, with Richard Nixon, the president, to look at least 4 dead alien creatures. There may have been more going on that night. It was the 19th anniversary of Eisenhower's encounter at Edwards Air Force Base in California. Okay. So that'll be my next book coming out later this year. It's another fascinating subject, and it just can't be a coincidence that they went to these air bases at night on the same exact date. Something was up.
And that the idea that Nixon told Gleason about this has been around for years, but I've never seen it dug into yet.
Yeah, but I'm just like Cape Girardeau, just like the Eisenhower story. Yes. I can't find any books on this, and I thought, well, I'm somebody. I'll write the darn thing myself and research it. I found that Nixon was greatly in need of hush money. The Watergate scandal had broken open, and he needed his Watergate burglars to keep their mouths shut, and they were demanding money for legal services and to support their families. And he needed money badly, and it had to have been done in secret. And Jackie Gleason was a big supporter, and now it starts to make sense that he may have contributed money for the grand desire to see hard proof with his own eyes that, we are being visited, that Nixon would have wanted the money. Gleason would have wanted the visual that he could almost put his hands on, that here are some dead extraterrestrials. Yes. So the story does make sense.
That's incredible. I look forward to that one also, because like I said, I've never heard beyond he went and saw it. He was very quiet. His wife said he had issues after that, but he also had a huge UFO library.
Yeah, and it really shook him up for a long time. He didn't work in movies for a couple of years after that incident, and he couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat properly. He smoked a lot, drank a lot. He was traumatized, and his wife said that he would also just suddenly turn giddy and excited that I finally got to see it. Me amongst all people on the planet, I've seen it with my own eyes. And then he would turn upset how can the government hide this from the people and make UFO observers and people who claim these things to look like idiots? How can they lie to the American people like this? And then his mood would change back and forth. And this went on for days and days, his mood swings on this, according to his wife. So it lends more credibility to the story, I think.
Well, if I can get past my audience with the UFOs, I want to do a conspiracy one. So yeah. I'm going to have you back, Paul.
Okay, sounds like a plan.
Paul Blake Smith, author of MO41. Is that how you're saying it, or Mo41?
Either way is fine with me. Mo41 or MO41, that's fine.
The bombshell before Roswell. And I think you've got enough evidence to say there's a very good chance Roswell was not the first UFO crash in this country.
That's right.
So, Paul, thanks again. I appreciate you coming in because I've been wanting to talk about this for years and finally got hold of you.
Okay. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thanks for having me on.
You bet. Take care. All right, my friends. I'll let you pick your own ideas on this one. Like I said, I've known about this story for years. It's incredible. There is enough, as he said, circumstantial evidence that, I don't know. I just think it's an awesome story. But I've got to ask you all a question. And have you become an UNX subscriber yet? And if not, why not? I can't do this for you, friends. I cannot come to your house and type it in. This is free. And there's plenty that comes with it. I want you to go to unxnetwork.com and hit for the subscription to become a member. It's free. And you know what you get out of this? Monthly UNX newsletter talking about ghosts, talking about UFOs, Bigfoot, what's going on, what kind of government conspiracies are going on. And someday we're going to do a good conspiracy story. There's access to the blog. It's called the X blog. And here you go, a free digital copy sent to you every 3 months of the quarterly UNX magazine. These articles are incredible. The new one just come out. I haven't got mine yet. I've gotten the digital copy. I do not have my paper copies yet, or I'd show you. But these magazines have some of the best writers, best investigators going out, checking this stuff out. And hey, if you're into ghosts, you got me. I write for that. I'm there almost every month. And there's some others who write. So, you got me. What more could you ask for? So get on the unxnetwork.com and become a subscriber. Join the team. You got all this free stuff waiting for you, and it would help me out. It would help you out. And if you know any friends, get them on here. Get them onto this free stuff. There's so little free anymore. This is quality entertainment if this is what you're into. So check it out for me, okay? And for the rest of you, all I can say is you all stay spooked. Good night.